This is a podcast about the 4 degrees of the divine will as told by Jesus to Luisa Piccarretta in her Book of Heaven. We are going to focus on the 4 degrees of the divine will. This is not meant to be an introduction to the divine will in any way. There are quite a few others who have done introductions, and the objective is to tackle the idea of the 4 degrees of the divine will as told by Jesus to Luisa Piccarretta, and to discuss what each of those degrees means and how to advance between the degrees to achieve what Jesus' desire is for all of us, which is to be in his 4th degree of his divine will. Also, towards the end of the podcast, we'll discuss the concentric circles and the symbolism of the sun and what the circles mean. First is the first degree, and the best way to characterize that is to say that the first degree encompasses all of creation, all creatures, everything ever created by God. All the rays of divine will permeates all things. And all things are in the divine will. Someone living in the first degree is someone who is concentrated upon themselves. They're very self-centered, and their concerns are all about their own corporal lives. They seldom consider God and may not even believe that there is a God. To emphasize what I just stated, I'm taking a quote out of volume 31 and wish to drive home the idea of how the divine will permeates all things by using this quote from Jesus. The inseparability of our will, such that the creature can neither do without it, nor can he live, nor separate himself, not even in hell itself. And such a statement was made by Jesus because he wants us to understand emphatically that the divine will is present in all of creation. The next slide mostly involves how to advance once you understand what the divine will is and you desire to live in it. Jesus provides 3 steps. One is you ask for the divine will, which is very simple. You understand what you're asking for, and that your soul be disposed to obtaining the divine will, to advancing through these degrees that we will discuss. So you can see by the other bullets on the slide deck that we wish to build upon what the church teaches and the sacraments provided by the church. So there is no surprises here in the first degree that you wish to become a good Catholic in order to move beyond the first degree. And that means taking advantage of all of the sacraments. Now, there are some who I've heard lecture on the divine will who would say that it's not necessary to to engage in certain sacraments such as confession once you're in the fourth degree, but I object to that take on it, and we'll discuss that a little later when we get to the fourth degree. But for now, just understand that the sacraments of the church are rich in grace, and we need to take advantage and avail ourselves of them in order to advance. It's also important to have a regiment or a prayer life that is somewhat structured. Recommendation in the Book of Heaven is to say a morning prayer where you ask the divine will to come within you, to reign within you, and to be present throughout all of your actions during the day. It's also important to think during the day that you're doing a certain action as an act in the divine will. And that becomes more natural as you practice being in the divine will. Do the same at the evening before retiring. Just ask that the divine will reign again within you during your rest. Very similar prayer. And a prayer that we're all hopefully familiar with, the Rosary, is a very important prayer that Mary, as our Blessed Mother, has given to us. And it's also important when you're in the divine will, and just to underline that importance, there's a quote out of volume 25 on the left-hand side: "So will the sweet and powerful beads of a rosary make her victorious and triumphant again before the divinity, conquering the kingdom of the divine fiat to make it come into the midst of creatures." So we want to say the rosary every day. It's a very important prayer. It doesn't matter if you're in the first degree or the fourth degree. The Chapel of Divine Mercy is another very powerful prayer, and I'm not going to delve into it here because I just want to focus on the divine will. It's one of the most important books I believe that I've read was Sister Faustina's Divine Mercy. And I see the divine will as building upon that book, and also building upon some of the mystical doctors of the church, his work, such as the Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross, Interior Castle by St. Teresa of Avila. And in my opinion, the Book of Heaven picks up where the Dark Night of the Cross leaves off. It's also important in the first degree for someone wishing to advance in the divine will to perform a self-assessment. And although it seems trite, and some people will think, well, I know all the 10 Commandments, I know the virtues, why do I need to do this? Once you begin your journey in the divine will, Jesus wishes you to advance. He wants everyone in the fourth degree. So as you make this effort and do this self-assessment, you may obtain insights that you haven't before. And it's Jesus' way of leading you and helping you through these degrees. And as I mentioned, just pray to the divine will as you go throughout your day, and perform each act, as many acts as you can recall, perform them in the divine will. Very important is to read the Book of Heaven. Jesus says in the Book of Heaven that every new knowledge obtained of the divine will also contains grace, and that grace will help fuel your journey through these degrees. So if you come out of the first degree, and in the first degree, I named it the Good Catholic, because you're doing everything you should be doing according to the church, and you're striving to understand and advance and practice the divine will. The second degree, if you come out of the second degree, and I've named this degree holiness, the degree of holiness, you are doing very much. In other words, you're very advanced in spirituality. You'll also be practicing contemplative prayer, and we'll talk about this in a minute. So the contemplative prayer comes about by contemplating the will of God in your acts. It's basically living a contemplative life. One of the prayers recommended in the Book of Heaven is called the Rounds, in which you go throughout all the divine acts, creation, all the acts from Adam onward, and you become part of those divine acts through prayer. In other words, you're sharing in those acts. That's a form of contemplation. That's definitely a contemplative prayer. And that's why I have it here in the second degree. It's much more easy to perform it when you're in this degree than in the first degree. Although everyone approaches these degrees from a different perspective, and they're spiritually disposed, or their souls are disposed in different manners as they start their journey in the divine will. Some may already be practicing contemplative prayer, and when you start off, you may want to do the rounds right away and find more fruit in doing those. So the assumption in the first degree that I had was that you're someone who was not performing contemplative prayer, and you're someone who may not even be such a good Catholic, or not even a Catholic at all, and it's important to adhere to the teachings of the Church, and also to take advantage of the many graces that are available via the sacraments of the Church in order to build the foundation to advance from one degree to another, and definitely to move out of the first degree to the second. So contemplative prayer, if you think of prayer as a two-way discussion, in other words, you're speaking to God, but God is speaking to you in a manner that you may not understand, or that you may not hear, you don't hear audibly, and it's more of a passive type of communication where you're receiving God's grace, and that grace is being infused within your soul. Someone advanced in contemplative prayer, when they practice it, contemplative prayer is almost a state of being, as opposed to specific words or standard prayers that are mentioned and recited. And in the second degree, as opposed to the first, your eyes are now raised to God, and your consideration is more about what God's will is for you in your life. And according to Jesus in the Book of Heaven, this is where you truly enter into the kingdom of the divine will. And that is because in the first degree, everything is in the first degree. All of creation, regardless of whether someone is attempting to advance within the divine will out of the first to the second, or if they are not interested in the divine will, but they're just living their lives as most people are. How to advance out of the second degree? As I mentioned, contemplative prayer is very important. One of the practices coming from Teresa of Avila in the Interior Castle, as she mentions, when you begin prayer, to think of an image of God within you. And of course, you cannot attain to God via an image, but it's a way of focusing yourself towards the divinity. And once you're focused, then you go beyond that image and you begin to consider the aspects of God that you cannot sense. One of the important aspects of the second degree is detachment. Detachment of the flesh in particular. And that's a term used by St. John of the Cross that you would see in the Ascent of Mount Carmel or in his Dark Night. Detachment of the flesh is simply to loosen the attachments, to rid yourself of the attachments of corporal matters, such as food, as a good example. That's why fasting is often something that is recommended to advance spiritually. And the reason for that, and any small attachment can be something that holds you back. It holds you back like a butterfly that's tied to a tree. Butterfly just can't move, and that attachment, it keeps it from flying and keeps it right where it is. And same with the soul. The soul cannot advance when it's attached to corporal things. Also, there's the drawback in this degree is that you can become stagnant. There's a couple of ways why. One is when you're first in prayer, especially contemplative prayer, there's a certain sweetness that God provides in this prayer life that's sensible. And as you advance out of it, that sensible sweetness tends to go away. And when people become attached, actually, to that sensible prayer life, to that sweetness that they experience in contemplative prayer, and they wish to retain it, not understanding that they need to go past that, and that that's natural for them no longer to feel that. Also, a bad barrier to advancement is pride and ignorance. Ignorance coming from a lack of understanding of the divine will, misunderstandings, which I've heard about how to live the divine will. They will definitely be barriers to advancement. Also, pride is abhorrent to God, and it's a barrier to advancement regardless of where you are in the divine will degrees. So as you get to the end, you would be someone who typically practices contemplative prayer. You're praying the rounds of the divine will, you're praying the rosary in the divine will. You're someone who lives a very good life, and someone who I would characterize as being holy. Going into the third degree, and again, I'm falling upon the teachings coming out of the Carmelite spirituality. And here I would term that this person here, at the end of the third degree, is a proficient. And the proficiency is in their prayer life, in their communication with God, and how they live their lives. So in contemplative prayer, if you get into the third degree, you could look at your soul as a container. As you remove the attachments to, whether they be attachments of the flesh or spiritual attachments, you gain more room in this container, and God can fill it more with His grace. When it gets to the point where your soul is filled with this grace, that's not the end of it. Your soul is a container that expands and grows. So the grace that God gives you is not necessarily grace that will overflow and be wasted, but it actually will improve your soul and make your soul grow and expand in order to receive that grace and more. In this third degree, it's important to talk about the detachment of the spirit. So, in the detachment of the spirit, and I mentioned the sweetness of contemplative prayer as you start off using it and practicing it. In the third degree, it's important to become spiritually detached, especially from that sweetness. But the detachment doesn't mean detachment from spiritual things, although that is part of it for sure. But it's mostly detachment from non-corporal things of this world. And a good example, and I'm going to use an example I've heard in a lecture on the divine will, and I can't recall, it was several years ago, and I can't recall who did it, but I like to give that person credit. He used the analogy of football, and this is a great analogy because anyone listening to this podcast is more than likely from the United States or Canada or England or Australia, and they're all familiar with football. So in the first degree, you may be someone who loves football, and you never miss your team's game, and it's something that's very important to you. If your team wins, you're happy. The team loses, you're very unhappy. So as you go into the second degree, you'll find that you may watch the football game, but you may miss a few because you're concerned about something else, and you're not putting your time away specifically for the game. You're not, in other words, you're not conforming your life to the football schedule. When you get to the third degree, you may find that you'll watch the football game, but you don't really care if your team wins or your team loses. You may miss more of the games. You may find that you might you're doing something habitually, like watching the game, but it's really not that important to you. When you get to the fourth degree, which we'll talk about next, you may not care about football at all. You may not watch any of the games. And that may scare some people, because some people, especially if they're in the first degree, may think, well, maybe I don't like football, but there's other things I'm attached to them. I really love music, and I like baseball, and I don't want to give these things up. And the way I'll describe it is not so much that you are giving them up, but it's more that you will lose interest in them because you're obtaining something that's so much greater. And it's very similar to the parable of the pearl of great price. So a merchant finds a pearl of great price, a very magnificent pearl. He sells everything that he owns and buys that pearl. So it's not that everything that he owned didn't have any value to him. It's that this pearl that he found has just so much more value that relative to this pearl of great price, everything else he owned seemed insignificant. So in the divine will, you're given so much more that these other things you may view as important now in your life become less and less important to you, to the point where they seem almost meaningless. Now that doesn't mean that you will not value your vocation. On the contrary, anything in your vocation, whether it be family, the priesthood, will become more important to you. But anything that's an ancillary attachment, let's say, you'll find to be not important. Because a vocation is basically God's plan for you. And you are performing God's will by performing your vocation, adhering to it. In the third degree also, you'll find that temptations will dissipate. So you may have certain temptations as you go through these degrees. They lose more and more influence over the soul. A sin will be very rare in the third degree. And imperfections, however, will still exist. So let's talk about how to advance in the third degree. Two of the most important recommendations is one's charity and love. And the most important is to love much. And that's a quote from Teresa of Avila regarding prayer life, how to advance in prayer regardless of where you are in it. And a quote from Jesus in the Bible, be perfect as your Father is perfect. And just to tie those two together a little bit, it seems like perfection seems like a very lofty target. And as you relate this to love, Jesus often is quoted in the New Testament as saying, love your enemy. One of the quotes is, it is not enough to love your friends and those who do good for you, because even the pagans do that. Love your enemy. Turn the other cheek. And that is really how our Father loves us. It's in many cases an unrequited love, where he loves us. However, we do not return it. However, the love that he has for us still exists, and he still provides that love. And we're asked to do that also. So it's easy to love someone who's a friend or a family member, but think about someone who dislikes you, and to provide and to love that person. Then you're loving as our Father loves us. And when you practice that love, it gives you a tremendous momentum. It's a tremendous catalyst to move through the prayer life and to move through these degrees. One thing I'd like to point out is we are talking about will and the divine will. The power of intention is very important. In the third degree, the intention, the will, and prayer become a bit merged together, a bit blurred, to lack of a better word, in the sense that your intention becomes an act of the will and also becomes your prayer. I'd like to point out also that actions, when we talk about actions of the will, it's really the intention that characterizes that action. So two different people can perform the exact same act. Say it's an act of charity. One performs it because he cares for the person who's receiving the charity. The other person performs the same act because he wishes to look good in the eyes of the world by performing that act of charity and being viewed as a charitable person. The first act is efficacious. The second act is definitely not efficacious at all, and in fact may be contrary to that. So that's kind of a hard concept to understand, but if you think about an act in the divine will, the intention really becomes the act of the will. And from our perspective, if you're living in the divine will and you intend, your intention becomes that act. Your intention becomes an act and a prayer. In the fourth degree, it's important to discuss the nature of the soul. And this is mentioned in both the Book of Heaven, it's also mentioned with the exact same components of the soul. It's mentioned in The Dark Night by St. John of the Cross. So there are three major components. You have the memory, the will, and the intellect. So in this case, in the fourth degree, you're sharing the will with the divinity. You're sharing in the divine will. In other words, your will and the divine will become one. And at this point, what I'd like to do is refer back to the analogy that Jesus has and why there's a symbolism of the sun in discussing the 4 degrees. In the Book of Heaven, Jesus describes the first degree, someone living in the first degree, as someone who lives in their home and has their windows shuttered and never goes out. So never goes out to enjoy the sun or see the light or feel the heat of the sun. But regardless of that, even some rays managed to creep through into his dwelling place. So he's still living within the light of the sun, so to speak. In the second degree, someone actually ventures out of their home and obtains some of the benefits of the light and the heat of the sun, but doesn't venture far and is only temporary and goes back into their home when they're finished being out in the sun's rays. In the third degree, this person leaves their home, goes to the highest point that's available, and meets the rays of the sun as high as possible. And in the third degree, this person appears to be transformed in the sun, but is not yet. In the fourth degree, that person then becomes so transformed in the sun's rays that it's hard to distinguish between that person and the sun. So you can see the level of differences, they're exponential between each degree based on Jesus' description of them, using the analogy of the sun. One of the things in the Book of Heaven, especially since it's brought up in the first chapter, is the idea of flying, and it's mentioned by Luisa Piccarretta quite often in the beginning of her Book of Heaven. And that's really a form of ecstasy when she refers to flying in the divine will. And I just want to mention that as an explanation. I'm not going to get into an introduction so much into the Book of Heaven, but I do want to explain that there's not her Book of Heaven does not in any way correspond to these degrees as they're presented in the 36 volumes that exist. Although the first few appear to be preparatory and or set forth in a manner that allows you to look at the disposition of Luisa Piccarretta's soul. In the fourth degree, there's only God. So that goes back to our football analogy. The person that I was trying to remember, he actually says there is no football in the fourth degree. And sin has disappeared. So someone who's new to the divine will might be shocked by that. But yes, in the fourth degree, you are living in a manner where you're sharing the will, the divine will of God, and there is no sin. You cannot commit sin and live within the divine will. So yes, that has disappeared. And as it regards to confession, regardless of whether you sin or not, you should still go to confession. And the reason being is you'll still have temptations. So in the Book of Divine Mercy by Saint Faustina, Jesus says that if you confess your temptations, all the temptations' power over you will vanish. And for some reason, that's something that is not very well known, but it's right there in black and white in the Book of Divine Mercy. And I've practiced it myself, and believe me, it does work. So I would recommend people in the fourth degree go to confession, maintain your relationship with all of the sacraments of the church, adhere to them. Even Jesus was baptized. So if Jesus can be baptized, you can go to confession. Now the next one is also a little difficult to understand, and I'll do my best to explain it. So a divine act is an act which by its nature of its being divine is eternal. So when a divine act is performed, also shares in all of the divine acts that have ever occurred. So the divine act of creation, the divine act of the nativity, divine act of the acts of Jesus' passion, all of the acts with the apostles, all of the divine acts ever performed. So there becomes a multiplicity of divine acts for every one that's performed that's infinite, as Jesus describes it in the Book of Heaven. So you're sharing all the divine acts, past, present, and future, and an act in the divine will becomes one of those divine acts and shares in those divine acts throughout all eternity. So there's a share in God's omnipresence. So that is really God's omnipresence, where God exists and permeates all things, and all acts are shared throughout all eternity. But don't confuse omnipresence with omniscience, with God's knowing all of things. They're two different things. So, into the fourth degree, you would think that's as far as we can go, but no, that's not the case. You'll find that people can advance within the fourth degree. Again, it's important to recall the natures of the soul. In the fourth degree, you're sharing the divine will. However, your memory and your intellect are not shared. So there is growth in those two areas of the soul, where your intellect will become more enlightened and your memories of profane things will dissipate and become filled more with the things of God. I mentioned about the relationship between intention, divine will, and prayer. Something else that I'd like to mention is in the Book of Heaven, Jesus explains that there are 9 choirs of the divine will in heaven. Not that we're referring to divine will choirs in heaven, similar to the 9 choirs of angels. So that tells you that, by implication, that you can advance within the fourth degree as well. And just to emphasize how important it is, increased knowledge of the divine will, 36 volumes. There's a lot of material to go through. The concentric circles representing the analogy of Jesus describing the Son and the divine will. The very inner circle, the fourth degree, represents the few that have made it to the fourth degree. And although there are few, Jesus wants everyone to be in the fourth degree. There are few now because it's not widely known about the divine will, and the teachings are still being analyzed by the church, although the first 19 volumes have been approved, and the confessor of Luisa Piccarretta has been declared a saint. When this study concludes, I have no doubt in my mind that Luisa Piccarretta will be declared a saint as well. If you look at her life is amazing. The many spiritual manifestations that accompany her in her life is truly amazing, and they're very reminiscent of previous state of saints that have passed. So the size of the fourth degree inner circle is counterintuitive from the perspective that although it's the smallest for now, it provides the most light and the most heat in this whole analogy, and less so in the third degree, less in the second, and of course less in the first. And it's where in the fourth degree is where the light shines the brightest and the heat is the hottest. Now the way that this was described from the first degree to the fourth degree is a path, is a spiritual journey that Jesus leads us on. And because this journey is really dependent upon Jesus and our disposition, the disposition of our soul spiritually, Jesus can take us as fast as he'd like to, or this could be a relatively slow process. It's dependent upon your willingness to obtain knowledge regarding the divine will from the Book of Heaven through all the readings of the 36 volumes, and also the dedication, willingness of the individual to advance. And that's why this podcast exists, to help you on that journey and help you hopefully move a little sooner to the fourth degree. The lines themselves around the different degrees have meaning also, and it's regarding sin. It's a play on the analogy of the interior castle by Teresa of Avila, where the saint says in your outer rooms of the castle you have more access to sin. In other words, there's less purity, there's less sanctity in the outside rooms than there are in the inside rooms. So that concept was adopted here also to the analogy provided by Jesus in the Book of Heaven. So the outer concentric circle is more porous, indicating that more sin is able to break into that first degree. And as a matter of fact, as Jesus mentions, the divine will permeates in all things, so sin does exist very much so in the first degree. Less so in the second degree. In the third degree, especially as you get towards the end of it, sin will be very rare. Also, temptations will dissipate very much so as you move through these degrees. As you get towards the third, or the end of the third, temptations will be few and far in between. When you get into the fourth degree, a sin, as mentioned previously, will disappear. Also, temptations will be very few and have very little power over you. The temptations will be like spitballs against a battleship. They'll be like waving gnats away at a picnic. Lastly, I'd like to provide some recommendations for introductory works about the divine will. There are two sources on YouTube I highly recommend. One is the Queen of Light Canticle. So if you do a search for Queen of Light Canticle, specifically mention Father Brown, it's Father Mark Brown. The same for the Center for the Divine Will. And if you extend that by saying Thomas Fahey, you'll get a lot of good introductory work to look at. Both of these gentlemen have passed away rather recently, unfortunately, and I consider them to be apostles of the divine will who have been working with the source materials for decades, I believe going back into the 1970s. And those two gentlemen are the reason why I've become introduced to the divine will myself. Lastly, but not least, I would like you to take a look at the website posted here, queenofthedivinewill.org, where you have each one of the volumes in the Book of Heaven available to be downloaded or printed. So it's very convenient. You can download them in PDF format, view them on your Kindle or tablet, or print them to a printer is what my choice is. And before we go, what I'd like you to do is, if you would like this content and you want to learn more about the divine will, please subscribe to my new channel. And I intend on producing additional podcasts concerning the divine will. The next one I'm already working on is the divine will as it pertains to the church. And I have quite a bit of material on that I'll be putting together in the next week or so. And lastly, if you are in the divine will, and I'm assuming that you are, that I would definitely wish to ask for your prayers for this fledgling ministry and for my own spiritual advancement as well. Thank you for listening.